Good morning, everyone, and we're really pleased to welcome you to the Back to School Congressional briefing on the incredibly important and timely topic of social media and youth mental health. I'm Matt Rizzo. I'm the chair of neurological sciences at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. I'm also proud to be the chair of the American Brain Coalition. So today, the ABC, together with the American College of Neuropsychopharmacology, the American Psychological Association, and the Dana Foundation are partnering with the Congressional Neuroscience Caucus to host this briefing, which, as I mentioned, is to examine the impact of social media on youth mental health. The Congressional Neuroscience Caucus is co-chaired by Congressman Earl Blumenauer and Congressman Morgan Luttrell. It's been around a while. It was established in 2010, and the intent was to build awareness of the intrinsic role, the critical role that brain research plays in understanding ourselves, our societies, and to communicate the progress and the benefits of this research. It's also functioning to help promote changes in federal policies to support neuroscience research. And today, we're honored to hear from both Congressional Neuroscience Caucus co-chairs. Mr. Blumenauer was planning to join us, but was pulled into a committee meeting at the last minute, which happens these days. Everyone knows that Congress is a very active place, and there are a lot of hot topics now. Anyway, we're thrilled that he was able to provide a recorded message. By way of background, Representative Blumenauer represents the 3rd Congressional District of Oregon. He's a lifelong resident of Portland. He's been around a while. He was first elected to the House in 1996, and he's used his time in Congress as a member of the Ways and Means Committee to promote issues that are very critically important to us all, namely healthcare access and environmental reform. Besides being a tireless champion for patients with neurological and psychiatric disorders, and for researchers discovering mechanisms that are targets for cures to mitigate the impact of these conditions, he's been a great colleague to us. We're thankful to him for his leadership, and I am pleased to share his video now. Roll it.
I want to thank everyone for joining us for this briefing today. We founded the Congressional Neuroscience Caucus over 10 years ago because I thought it was important that members of Congress pay more attention to brain health. This briefing is a good reminder that it isn't just about conditions like dementia. It's about how parts of everyday life can impact our brains, even young people who are still going through brain development. It's no secret that we have a mental health crisis, especially amongst our youth. Suicide is the 2nd leading cause of death for young people and young adults, and suicide rates in this age group increased over 50% between 2000 and 2021. The Surgeon General has issued advisories on youth mental health, including one about the way social media can impact children and young adults. Social media can have a positive impact when we're talking about connections and community, but it also brings risk from the way negative, traumatic events are shared to cyberbullying and hate-based content. And the increased constant usage of social media poses challenges to brain development. Studies are showing that children who grew up with social media have had changes in their brain development when it comes to reacting to the world around them. The research being done through the ABCD study is a huge achievement in learning more about how children are affected by factors like social media, and I'm glad we'll be hearing about this work today. It's clear that more research is needed to make sure we're using these tools appropriately and adding guardrails where necessary. We all know that social media is here to stay, for better or worse, so we should be taking every step to make sure that it's being used in a positive and not a harmful fashion. I'm grateful to our panelists for the work that they do on youth mental health and brain development, and looking at social media, among other factors that kids encounter all the time. This work will be critical in the years to come, and I look forward to learning from you and with you. Thank you very much.
Well, We appreciate the compelling message from Representative Blumenauer. We're also grateful to be working with Congressman Luttrell, who, of course, is subject to the same workload and pressures as Congressman Blumenauer, and he also sends his regrets for not being able to attend because he has to take care of business. But he did send a video message. Representative Luttrell has boots on the ground experience with some of the issues that are important to us. He's currently serving his first term representing Texas's 8th Congressional District. His passion for brain matters comes to the caucus after he survived a helicopter crash in 2009 that left him with a traumatic brain injury. It was a horrific event, and he was a survivor, and he moved on. He retired from the Navy after an honorable 14-year career, and then he achieved an important advanced degree in applied cognition and neuroscience at UT Dallas. And he works tirelessly to help fellow veterans recover from PTSD and TBI sustained in battle. We're deeply grateful to him for his leadership in the Congressional Neuroscience Caucus, and I'm very pleased to share his video now.
Hello, my name is Morgan Luttrell, Congressman from Texas District 8 and co-chair for the Neuroscience Caucus. And today we're going to chat about social media and the effects that it has on our children. Now, 2/3 of Americans say that social media negatively affects their family, their friends. Teen social media directly correlates to sleep inequality, heightened degrees of depression, anxiety, decreased cognitive sustainability. It's important for researchers like myself and policymakers to come together so we can better understand what social media is doing to our country. God bless.
That was short and sweet and to the point. So let me turn it over now to Sarah Tim. She's the executive director of the ACNP, and she's going to provide some brief remarks. Sarah?
Thank you, Dr. Rizzo. So ACNP is proud to sponsor this event with the American Brain Coalition. The ACNP is an organization of the top brain and behavior scientists internationally. Our college really is drawn from scientists who have a diverse field and subfields of neuroscience, which includes behavioral pharmacology, clinical psychopharmacology, epidemiology, genetics, molecular biology, neurochemistry, neuroendocrinology, and many other aspects of psychiatry and psychology. We're honored to be here and help support the American Brain Coalition. And I have to say, as a mother of a 5 and 15-year-old who battles the social media and screen wars each and every day, I'm excited about the presentation we're going to hear today. Thank you.
I wanted to say thank you to Sarah, and before I introduce experts on today's topics, a little housekeeping, and that is to remind everyone to submit questions in the Q&A box at any time. We'll be allowing the last minutes, 15 or so, for questions. So now it's my great pleasure to turn the event over to the leaders of the ABCD that you've heard about already, the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study. This is the largest long-term study of brain development and child health care ever conducted in our nation. The study is housed at the NIH's National Institute of Drug Abuse, and it has 21 research sites across the country. Two leaders of the ABCD study are with us today, and they are Dr. Gaia Dowling, and she's the director of the ABCD study, and Dr. Elizabeth Hoffman, who's the Senior Scientific Program Manager. So without further ado, I'd like to turn matters over to Dr. Dowling and Dr. Hoffman. Please take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Rizzo. We are really delighted to be here today to tell you a little bit about the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study, or ABCD, and some of the findings that have come out related to social media and really all digital media among youth. So why are we doing this? We know that adolescence is a time of extraordinary physical, emotional, and intellectual growth. And as you can see here from my experiment over the last since ABCD began, individuals are also going through these changes, and they all have different experiences. And there's so much we don't know about how those experiences affect brain, social, emotional, and academic development. But in order to do that, you need a large study so that you can see all of the different factors that influence development and the different trajectories that they result in. So we launched this study in 2016 and began enrolling youth from across the country. We've enrolled 12,000, almost 12,000 youth when they were 9 and 10 years old. And we assess them annually to get a lot of information about their lives. So as Dr. Rizzo mentioned, we have 21 sites across the country that have been participating in this study. And together they've enrolled close to 12,000 youth. And the way we did this was each site went to schools in their area and invited all of the kids that were in 4th and 5th grade to participate in the study. And then people volunteered to be a part of it. And through this method, we were able to recruit about 10,000 youth. But we were also interested in understanding interactions between genes and the environment. So we made a particular effort to enroll 2,000 or so twins and triplets into the study using twin registries in 4 states, in Minnesota, Colorado, Virginia, and Missouri. And one of the goals with ABCD was to enroll a cohort that matched the demographics of the country. And so we made particular effort as we were going to schools to ensure that that would happen. And as you can see here, we have approximately 50% male and 50% female. And when you look at the racial and ethnic breakdown, we match closely the American Community Survey. So we have about 50% white, 15% Black or African American, and 20% Hispanic. And this was very important for us to be able to get a data set that would reflect the conditions across the country. So what are we collecting? As I mentioned, we know that youth are going through many different experiences in this time period, and you have to look at all of those experiences in context of other experiences. Nothing happens in isolation. So we collect a vast amount of data. We collect things in physical health, such as height and weight, sleep patterns, puberty, sports and activities that they participate in. We collect a lot of information about mental health, both from the caregivers and the youth themselves, so that we can understand the development of depression, anxiety, ADHD, and other mental health disorders. We also ask questions about substance use. When we began, there was very little substance use in the cohort, thankfully. But as the youth have grown, we're starting to see more substance use. And it's important for us to understand what that effect is on the brain. And having enrolled the youth when they're 9 and 10 before they use substances and before many of the mental health disorders emerge, we're able to see what those trajectories look like and what impacts them. But in order to do that, we also need to take a look at the world around them. So we ask questions about their culture and environment, such as, whether they've experienced discrimination, acculturation, whether they feel safe in their schools and their neighborhoods. And then we also do a number of neurocognitive tasks where we're trying to get task-based information. So rather than surveys, actually have them play what seem like games to tap into things like memory and attention, math skills, so that we can track that over time as well. And then, of course, we have neuroimaging. So we do structural brain imaging as well as functional brain imaging, MRI. And with the functional, we do it at rest so we can see what their brain is doing when they're not doing anything, as well as during some of those tasks. Then in addition to that, we collect some biospecimens. So we collect blood from which we get information on cholesterol and hemoglobin A1C, as well as genetic information. We also collect saliva and hair and baby teeth, which can give us an insight into environmental exposures during pregnancy. We also have started to collect information, objective information from youth. So for example, we have the youth wear Fitbits for 3 weeks, so we can get objective information about sleep patterns and activity levels. We also have an app that we've put on several of the phones to get some objective measures of their screen time use. And Dr. Hoffman will talk a little bit more about that when she starts. And then, of course, because the COVID pandemic, upended all of their lives, it was very important for us to understand both their infection as well as the impacts of the pandemic itself on youth development. So we introduced some additional questionnaires to do that. And we're also hoping to be able to study long COVID. We're a unique resource for COVID research because we have brain imaging data from prior to the pandemic as well as after the pandemic. So we can see whether things have changed within an individual. And then lastly, we collect geocoded data. So based on their residential histories, we're able to get data from existing data sets that tell us again about the environment in which they live. So we can get information about air quality, about green space, about laws in their areas, about their educational environment, all of which is really important to contextualize the other data that we're collecting from them directly. So we do this, as I mentioned, we see them annually. So we began when they were 9 and 10 years old, and we collected all of the information that I talked about, a very long day for the youth, including the MRI. And we repeat that every 2 years. In the intervening year, we have a much smaller visit where they don't do an MRI, but we get information on what has happened to them since the year before. And then every 6 months or so, we have a touch base with them, a short phone call, mostly to understand whether the recency of initiation of drug use and some health factors. And the plan is to repeat this pattern until they're 19 and 20 years old. I think one of the most important things about the ABCD study is that we have adopted an open science model. So we're collecting all of this data, but we didn't want it limited to the researchers that are collecting the data to be able to analyze it. So we make the data, de-identified data, available to the scientific community to be able to conduct research after they've gone through an approval process. And this is very important because there's so many things that can be done with this data set. It collects so much information that there are more scientific questions than even our large consortium can answer. So we wanted to make sure that other scientists are able to access this data and do some analysis. We're also excited that they're pooling our data with other data sets so that you can get even larger numbers to be able to look at some of the complicated questions. And a lot of scientists are using this for development of new methods and tools for brain research. But I think most importantly, we hope that all of this research will lead to the development of interventions to help and policies and practices to help youth stay on positive trajectories. We're really excited that since we released the first data in 2018, there have been more than 700 scientific papers published using ABCD data, and these have been covered by many news outlets that you are all familiar with. But I have to say that the question that I probably get asked the most is, what does screen time do to my youth? So I'm going to turn it off to Dr. Elizabeth Hoffman to give you some insight into some of the findings that have emerged so far.
Thanks, Gaia, and thanks everyone for being here. So I'm just going to run through some of the findings that have emerged on looking at screen use broadly in the ABCD study. So this includes social media, but also a variety of other activities that youth do engage with on their phones and other platforms. And just to sort of as a leveling exercise here, screen use in ABCD is defined as any kind of activities, including texting, video gaming, streaming movies, and so on. And so as Gaia mentioned, there are a couple of ways that we assess data in ABCD, and this is in with regard to screen use as well. So we have subjective reporting. An example of a question to assess screen use in ABCD is here. On a typical weekday or weekend, how much time per day does your child spend in total on a computer, cell phone, tablet, and so on, not including school-related activities. So we wanted to be sure to contextualize this to non-school related screen use. And then the second approach is objective recording. So this is a passive approach, using an app on a smartphone, an iPhone or an Android, to collect data on amount of time spent in a variety of ways in using screens. And here on the right is just a snapshot of some of the assessments that have been included in ABCD. And as you can see, P is parent, C is child. So these are questions that are asked both of the parent or the guardian and of the youth. And initially, the very first set of questions were around time, which is why I put this question here on the left. So how much time in total? And then as we moved through the years of the study, we're more interested, or in addition to that, interested in not just how much time youth are spending on their screens, but what they're doing on their screens. Because as you've heard already, there are differences. There can be positive benefits to engaging on social media, for example. There could be less positive benefits on other types of screen activity, for example, playing first-person shooter games, as an example. And so we really wanted to be able to disentangle all of that. And so that's why you see here lots of different ways that we're collecting that data and different types of applications that are interrogated. You can go to the next slide. Well, the other point I wanted to quickly make is that the issue with self-reporting is that there can be underreporting, both by youth and by the parent or the guardian, in terms of how much screen use youth are engaged in. And so that was another reason why we wanted to capture this objectively. And it turns out in some of the data analyses that that's been borne out, that there are differences in how much is reported versus how much time is actually spent on screens. So the first thing that we can see, not surprisingly, is that youth use screens more as they get older. So we began the study, as you heard from Dr. Dowling, when the youth were 9 and 10 years old. And as they've progressed developmentally, their amount of time spent on screens, again, outside of school related, steadily increasing. And just to contextualize this for you, when they were 12 and 13 years old, this was during the heat of COVID-19. And so there was obviously social distancing that increased screen use activity among these youth. Next slide. So I wanted to share with you a couple of things here, just looking broadly at some of these data. And so this is to share with you some of the findings looking at self-report side by side with objective recording of screen use. So the first thing that we can see is that social media and streaming videos are the most frequently reported screen activities by both boys and girls, and social media here in green, streaming in purple, and so on. And this is the average daily screen time here on the x-axis. You can click through to the next one. We also see, perhaps more soberingly, is that the majority of the youth in ABCD are actively engaging with their phones in the middle of the night. So this is data from that objective passive recording from the app on their phone. This is a Fitbit here. That was my mistake. That should be a phone, not a Fitbit. But just to show you how the data are captured. And you can see here that this data, that at least one keystroke means that the youth are actively engaging. They're doing something with their phones. They're not just listening to music or hearing a podcast. They're actively doing something all throughout the night, which is pretty concerning. Next slide, please. So we also see that average daily screen use differs for boys and girls. Again, maybe not so surprising. It isn't that boys and girls are using different or doing different things on screens, but they're spending more time on one than another. So for example, boys spend more time on single player video games, on multiplayer video games, and streaming TV and movies than girls, whereas girls spend more time on video chat, on texting, and on social media. And this was data when the youth were 12 and 13, again, during COVID, just to sort of contextualize that for you. We also see when comparing screen use that those participants in the study who used screens more often showed a small increase in sleep problems, in symptoms corresponding to attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, lower grades in school, and number of close friends, which is a positive. The rest of these are not so positive, but I should also caution that these are associations. This is not causal research. So these are showing patterns and links with screen use and mental health and cognition outcomes. We also found, researchers also found that video gaming is associated with some positive benefits, including problem-solving skills, flexible thinking, recalling facts and skills, whereas social media is associated with decreases in problem solving. So it isn't, the point of this is to show you that it's a nuanced set of findings. So this is not all good news or bad news, it's really a mix. And depending on not just how much time folks are spending on screens, but what they're doing on screens and the different kinds of associations that emerge with mental health, physical health, cognition, and sleep, and so on. Next slide, please. Research has also shown that every additional hour spent watching videos was associated with less sleep. And together, when combining more video watching and sleep problems, those things combined were related to small increases in feeling anxious or depressed, feeling withdrawn, and having thought problems. And I should also mention that these are not clinical diagnoses. These are symptoms that youth are reporting. Next slide, please. And in particular, 2 hours or more of screen use per day was associated with an increased likelihood of having a depressive disorder or suicidal thoughts and attempts or self-harm in both boys and girls. And in boys, but not in girls, it was also associated with an increased likelihood of anxiety. So there seems to be something about 2 hours or more. Less than that, these findings don't seem to emerge. And this may be in line with guidelines recommended by the American Academy of Pediatrics and how much screen use is recommended. Next slide, please. And then in another association study, researchers have looked at cyberbullying, both from the standpoint of perpetrating cyberbullying, but also being a victim of cyberbullying. And this is one of the questionnaires that's asked of participants in the mental health domain that Dr. Dowling spoke about earlier. So these data are used to associate with screen use. And researchers found that the cyberbullying risk increases with each additional hour of screen use. So we're starting to see a pattern here that the more screen use youth are engaged in, the more likely it is that that will be associated with particular health outcomes. Participants who played single-player video games had a 14% greater chance of being cyberbullied for each additional hour of game time. And for each additional hour of total screen time, so this is in addition to playing video games, other activities as well, participants had an 11% greater chance of experiencing cyberbullying and a 10% greater chance of cyberbullying someone else. So both ends of this experience are impacted by screen use. And while we may think this is not so surprising, the more time kids spend on screens, the more likely it is that they'll be involved in some kind of cyberbullying. I think that it could, further analyses can help disentangle some of this a little bit more if we can understand, for example, which types of screen activity are more strongly associated. We can use that possibly as a target for interventions. Next slide, please. Oh, it's not showing up on my screen. Okay, there we go. And as Dr. Dowling mentioned, we had a rich data resource pertaining to the COVID-19 pandemic. So there was a lot of additional data collection that was done to understand the impacts of experiencing the pandemic on the youth. And one finding that emerged was that during COVID-19, youth with poorer mental health and greater stress said that they used screens more often than youth who had more social support and other coping behaviors. So even though during COVID, there was in aggregate much more screen use, much more engagement with screens, there were differences in how those screens were used for youth with or without pre-existing mental health conditions or symptoms of mental health problems. Next slide, please. So this was really a very fast and kind of a snapshot of findings that are emerging. And I want to just point out that as Dr. Dowling mentioned, this is a long-term study. It's a 10-year endeavor. And so the data that I presented to you are very much dynamic, right? So their associations are not causal relationships yet. As the study progresses, as we have opportunities to disentangle many of these factors, we can get more at interrogating those findings and really try to understand causal mechanisms. But this is why I put this cautionary statement here at the top, that these studies, and really not just these screen use studies, but many of the studies that are coming out using ABCD data show association. So in this case, showing that time spent on screens is associated with many, many factors, both good and bad, at the time that the data were collected. So even though this is a longitudinal study, these data were in large part snapshots in time. They don't show that one thing caused something else. And importantly, many other factors could affect the findings, which may also change over time and across development. And so ABCD supported researchers, both within the consortium and outside the consortium, via the open science model that Dr. Dowling discussed, continue to explore many of these questions. And below here is just a little bit of news coverage that you can look at in your own time on some of these major findings on screen use that have come out in ABCD. And next slide, I think I just have one more thank you slide. So we really want to thank all of the youth and their families. As Dr. Dowling mentioned, there are close to 12,000 youth participating in this study. We're in year 7 now, so they've been with us and very dedicated for all this time. And we obviously couldn't do this without them. So we want to make sure to thank them for their continued involvement, and a couple of links here for you in case you would like some more information. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dowling and Dr. Hoffman. Those presentations were fascinating. What a treasure trove of data you have on a really important topic. And your presentations, which were required to be brief, raised so many questions about novel clinical trials, the role of dyadic relationships between parents and children, using experience sampling to monitor what's actually happening in a person's mind and how they're doing in the field, and on and on and on, and especially what will you do for next steps? I'm sure that will be part of the discussion. So next, what I'd like to do is to introduce Dr. Mitch Prinstein. We're so glad to have him. He's the Chief Science Officer of the American Psychological Association. So Dr. Prinstein, please take it away.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here. My job today, and I'll try and do it briefly, is to give you an overview of what we know in the psychological science literature on the role of social media on adolescent development. Coincidentally, I myself have been someone studying this topic for about 10, 15 years or so. So I'll be interspersing information from the psychology literature and some findings from the labs that I've been involved in as well. Generally speaking, I'm going to very quickly give you an overview of what we know about the human brain and the adolescent human brain that might be especially relevant to understand for social media. I'll talk about a bunch of different findings, and I'll skip over some of those in the interest of time, but please do get in touch if I can be helpful. And then I'll talk about the health advisory. So let's go back just a little bit, 60,000 years particularly, to tell you why it is that social media might be playing an important role in adolescent development. We were not the only species back then, and anthropologists suggest that one of the reasons why we're here and they're not is not because we were bigger, stronger, hardier, but because we had genetic mutations that changed our voice box and changed our brain in ways that gave us the rudiments of language. This is incredibly important because it's defined us as a social species that allowed us to have herding instincts and a remarkable sensitivity to social signals. And that's why this is important today. We are very much attuned to a sophisticated range of verbal and nonverbal signals, and very sensitive to signals that indicate that we may be getting accepted or rejected by our peers. This advantage has particular implications for thinking about the new world that we live in, which is only about 20 years old, in which the context of our social relationships has changed quite dramatically. Some research that has demonstrated just how important our social connections may be has suggested that even at just the moment that we experience social exclusion, and research that's been done while individuals are getting their brains scanned in an fMRI, demonstrates remarkable and powerful effects in the brain's warning system, suggesting that within just minutes of social exclusion, our brain tells us to engage in dramatic changes in our behavior to ensure our survival. And even within every cell in our bodies, we have an upregulation of inflammation responses to protect us from harm, injury, or bacterial infection within just moments after a social rejection experience, and a downregulation of viral immunity, which anyone who's been through a pandemic knows, if you're not surrounded by a lot of other people, you can't get a virus. So we see this downregulation of viral immunity in our lab within about 40 minutes in the blood after social rejection. So we've had many different things that have happened in technology advances within our social context over the course of our species. The printing press, the telephone, email, why are we talking about social media as something that might be changing adolescent development in a way that's different or perhaps more alarming than the way that we've talked about these other technological advances? Well, the science is still accumulating, and it might be that we don't have to worry too much more about social media than those other technological advances. But what we do know is that social media has changed many different aspects of our social context and has done so dramatically, quickly, and simultaneously. We now interact with each other not in real time. What we say and do and post has permanence on the worldwide audience. Adolescents are expected to be available to each other 24/7 to comment on each other's posts, and often to comment while stripping down many of those sophisticated nonverbal and verbal cues to now simply just a few cues that they have to respond to. Perhaps most importantly, this is a very visual medium where we can post pictures of ourselves and get immediate feedback on our appearance or our body shape. And we actually get a quantified vote on how much we, our ideas, our thoughts and feelings are approved or disapproved by a number of thumbs up signals or not. Perhaps most concerning, though, is that we now have computers that are changing our social context by deciding for us who we should be friends with, in what order we see their posts, and how we should direct our attention. And that's the first time in the history of our species that we've outsourced some social decision making to a computer. Well, the adolescent brain in particular is important to understand because after the first year of life, the adolescent transition represents the most substantial period of brain reorganization than we see in the lifespan. And the adolescent brain doesn't mature all at once. Starting about a year or two before we see observable signs of puberty on the outside of the body, the brain has already been changing from areas below the cerebral cortex to the areas very unique to our species on top, and from regions towards the back, towards regions in the front. Well, what that means is that one of those first regions to adapt is within the anterior cingulate cortex. And due to a proliferation of brain substances you've heard of, oxytocin and dopamine, adolescents start rolling their eyes at their parents because they're suddenly much more interested in interacting with their peers and determining how much they're getting rewarding feedback or avoiding punishment from their peers. That is something that's driven in most mammals. We see that through oxytocin receptors, and it feels really, really good through dopamine when they experience that kind of peer feedback. Well, this period of brain reorganization and this time where they're biologically primed to care desperately what their peers think of them is happening at the exact moment that we're handing most of them devices. This is a period from starting around age 10 or so where they're hypersensitive to peer feedback. And until they're 25, they don't have a fully developed brake pedal. That's a fully developed inhibition system in their prefrontal cortex that allows them to stop pursuing every possible urge to get that peer feedback. When we talk about social media in the literature, we have to recognize that social media is a very different thing for every kid based on what platform they are and what kid they are. We think about it as a combination of not only the content that is shown to them or they self-select into, but also in combination with specific functions on social media, for instance, the like button or the ability to accrue followers. And that's combined with now artificial intelligence. So when we talk about social media, we have to recognize that there are many different aspects to that experience, and they all might affect development in different ways. I know that folks really want an age where we can say before their birthday, they're at risk, and after their birthday, they are totally safe. But we know in science that adolescent development is gradual and continuous. There's some very mature 12-year-olds and very immature 25-year-olds. So we as scientists really think differently about how we can understand which conditions and which situations and which children might specific features or content help kids' development or might harm their development. The way that scientists think about social media is therefore looking at least 9 separate sub-questions that we unpack in the literature to say, the way that we would understand social media and adolescent development is to understand potential benefits, the kinds of ways of using social media that might be important, which kids are most susceptible, how is tech actually promoting adaptive content or promoting maladaptive content, How is it changing peer influence processes? How is it causing different forms of stress for adolescents? What are teens not doing for every minute that they are on social media? And what is problematic, or what some people call addictive, social media use? And also, how might the brain development be altered based on the new social context kids are in? I don't have time to talk about all these, but I'll very briefly just hit on 4 of them. As we've heard from Dr. Dowling and Dr. Hoffman, there are, in fact, positive ways that social media can contribute to development, particularly for those from minoritized or marginalized communities who might be experiencing the opportunity to connect with others who they don't have in their schools or in their homes, to share in their experience of minority stress, to gain access to helpful medical or health information, and to gain important sources of social support. In some, if we took away social media from every kid below a certain age, we would be harming those who are from communities that desperately need the opportunity to connect with others who share similar identities. We also know that social media was helpful during the COVID lockdown by providing necessary social companionship. Research demonstrates that kids' online peer contacts are more diverse than their offline peer contacts, because their offline peer contacts are still restricted by their community or schools, which are still in part segregated. We don't let adolescents do everything that they enjoy doing, but for what it's worth, adolescents do report that they enjoy their experience online and often have positive interactions. And we've seen many social movements led by adolescents who now can connect to a worldwide audience to engage in broad civic activism in the way that we just couldn't do before social media existed. We're also seeing some ways that peer influence can play a role, and we know that this is affecting not only kids, but also adults. Through very simple social psychological processes that have been studied for years, things like overgeneralization errors or pluralistic ignorance errors, we know that what kids are exposed to changes how they think behaviors may or may not be acceptable. One interesting research study, for instance, demonstrated that 9th graders who looked at posts online depicting themes around alcohol and approving statements about drinking 5 or more drinks on a single occasion, which is a lot for an adult and especially for a kid, were more likely longitudinally to develop beliefs that their peers must think it's okay to drink that much on a single occasion. And once they had those beliefs, that was longitudinally associated with their own likelihood of heavy episodic drinking within that school year. Really elegant demonstration that what we see online influences what we think others believe and therefore changes our own behavior. I think we heard some great results from ABCD already about sleep. I just want to point out that the American Academy of Sleep Medicine suggests that teens get about 8 to 9 hours of sleep a night. Only 40% of 9th graders are getting that. Only about 20 some odd percent of 12th graders are getting that. And research has demonstrated over 90% of studies that this is because of screen time as the #1 reason. And it's not just any screen time, but it's social media use in particular. Again, the ABCD study did a beautiful job of showing us that that was the #1 reason why kids were on their screens. Well, research has demonstrated that the more kids have disrupted sleep or later sleep onset, that's actually changing the size of their brain growth in particular regions over time. Other research has demonstrated that it changes the way that the brain works. So we're seeing structural and functional changes in brain development as a result of disrupted sleep or delayed sleep onset. Really a very powerful argument that social media is affecting sleep, and sleep is affecting the way that the brain is growing. But there's more. In our lab, in combination with Dr. Eva Telzer at UNC Chapel Hill, we've been looking even more at the ways that it might be related to brain development by looking at how much kids pick up their phones or engage in certain social media use at 1 grade, and then doing multiple scans of their brains over time. Well, in a recent paper in JAMA Pediatrics, results demonstrated that the number of times they're picking up their phone, so that's the number of times that they're interrupting what they're doing to instead attend to their screen. Again, our data says for social media use, and based on their own phones telling us, not their self-report, This is on average 100 times a day for average kids, and 400 to 500 times a day they're picking up their phone. We're seeing that their development of hypersensitivity in regions of the brain that make them particularly attuned to social feedback. We also see less activation in the prefrontal cortex, which is an area that regulates our helps us with inhibition. So in other words, kids who are using their phone a lot in sixth grade might be developing a really hypersensitive gas pedal for more peer feedback, and maybe a little bit of a less functional brake pedal for inhibitory responses. More research is needed for this to be replicated in studies like ABCD. So based on these results and many other results that are in the literature, many of which I skipped over, the APA put together a summary of what we can say so far based on what we know. We don't have causal data. We can't randomize kids into high or low social media conditions. That would be unethical. But we have enough to say that there are things we should take a look out for and do more research on. And based on that information, we put together 10 summary statements. One is that we should really encourage kids to use social media in ways that promote adaptive development, healthy socialization. But we should also be careful to recognize that these platforms are developed for adults, and there are very few, if any, adaptations to young brains and young minds when they use it. So we should think about how to tailor the experience to those developing brains. Even simple things like privacy notifications that come up to tell you the rules have changed are written in 72 screens of legal adult language, and there's really very little adaptation to understand how a young person may or may not be well equipped to accept those changes on their profiles. We should not monitor use by parents looking over their kids at every minute they're online, of course not. But instead, we should have parents talk with their kids, especially among young ages, to understand the extent to which their kids are experiencing, processing, and reacting appropriately to what it is they might be doing online. And that would come from more conversations between parents and kids. We should absolutely be taking down content that teaches kids how to cut themselves or engage in eating disordered behaviors and encourages them and rewards them for doing so. We absolutely should be taking down content that promotes discrimination, prejudice, hate, or other cyber hate and cyberbullying, and teach kids how to stand up for those who are targeted. We should routinely screen for symptoms of addictive or problematic social media use. In our data, we see at least 50% of kids reporting very significant withdrawal and tolerance symptoms that is making it impossible for them to engage in daily roles and routines. Let's limit use that encourages social comparison, a very hard task, but one that we can do. We should train all kids on social media literacy, just the way that we expect any driver to demonstrate competence and knowledge of the road and their vehicle before we hand them the keys to their car. And we desperately need more research that will help us to understand social media usage, in addition to the great research that's happening in studies like ABCD. When we talk about social media literacy, I'll direct you to our documents on the APA website that will walk you through what 10 possible areas of digital media literacy may be. Psychological scientists have developed randomized clinical trials to demonstrate fun and effective ways to teach kids each and every one of these areas, which can help them to learn the rules of the road before they get online unfettered. With that, I'm going to go ahead and pause, but I want to make sure there's time for questions. And here's some ways to contact me if you have any questions after today's event as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Prinstein. That was magnificent. It was jam-packed with information in a short time. I learned a lot, and I'm sure others did as well. And so after these wonderful presentations, I think there are multiple questions. They're scientific, they're ethical, they're administrative, they're regulatory, they're educational. What I would like to do is go into the Q&A. I see that there have been several questions asked and answered from our previous speakers. I will go then to active questions. And the first up is from Lauren North, who may want to ask the question herself. I'll read what she wrote, and that is, what exactly can Congress do about this issue? Also, is this something that should be addressed on the federal level or state level, or I guess both? Dr. North, did you want to embellish on that? Or actually, let me pose to the speakers, does anyone want to tackle this?
Sure, I'd be happy to, if that's okay.
Please do. Yes.
So let's pass the COSA Act for starters. I think that that's a nice beginning. It's not the end, however. Let's see absolutely at the federal and the state level, we should be thinking about ways that we can help to create the resources necessary to make possible more psychological research on these topics. It's so incredibly important. The amount of money that's dedicated right now to institutes like the NIMH to do this is not enough, given how important this issue is and how much it's changing the social development of an entire generation. I think it's critical that we think about age-informed design, and that's something that can be addressed as well. I think we have to find incentives for these wonderfully brilliant technological platforms to want to provide more developmentally appropriate stimuli on their systems, and to build social media training into what they're doing. If that's not able to be done from the tech companies, let's fund and train schools and parents directly on how they can understand the science so they can make the best decisions for their kids, to use social media in all the ways that can benefit and to minimize the harms.
Thank you, Dr. Prinstein. Let's move on to the next question, and that is anonymous. And I also want to say, I ask people to chime in. Actually, you can't chime in, so don't worry about it. So the next question is, the Surgeon General's recent advisory on youth mental health highlights how the COVID-19 pandemic moved more of our lives onto social media platforms. Given this reality, what policy and research recommendations can be made to implement best practice guidelines for youth on social media? Again, anyone is welcome, any of our speakers is welcome to answer. Any takers?
I know there's some great ABCD data on COVID. So do y'all want to address
Dr.
that?
Hoffman, Dr. Dowling?
I was actually going to ask Elizabeth if she wanted to tackle that, but we do have a lot of interesting data on COVID-19. And as Elizabeth showed, we are seeing greater use during those periods. I'm trying to remember what the second half of the question was. Best practices. But we don't know yet the long-term outcomes. And so I think that's an area of research that we really need to understand. And with ABCD, we will continue to follow these kids so we can see what those long-term outcomes are. And we can dig deeper into what are the specifics, because I think all of the speakers have talked about how it's not just amount of time you're spending on any platform. It's what you're doing, how you're doing it, and what you're not doing when you're doing it. And so we need to be able to tease that apart in order to inform the development of guidelines so that we know exactly what is causing the outcomes that we see down the road.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dowling. The next question from an anonymous attendee is, how can policymakers ensure that tech companies implement age-appropriate health and safety standards on social media platforms? Again, Drs. Hoffman, Dowling, Prinstein, any thoughts?
Sure, I'm happy to jump in. I think that there are some really great people who are working at the tech companies who are very much wanting to do what's best and what's right. But some of the changes that we're talking about may not be primarily leading to increased profit or increased engagement. So it may be the case that policymakers need to find ways to compel or incentivize tech companies to make some of these changes. This is a business at the end of the day, and I can't speak personally to what would motivate the business to work on this, but I believe there are good people there who would like to do this, but might need a little push.
And I just like to add, I think that, researchers really want to partner with these platforms so that we can better understand the impacts. So greater cooperation, working with the social media companies to be able to understand what the impacts would be very helpful.
Thank you. So the questions have been popping in and out. One of them had to do with how the social media companies actually interact with each other, but that's perhaps related also to the next question, which is what sort of cooperation do scientists need from social media platforms and I guess companies in order to understand how kids are using and interacting online? Again, please take it away.
I can add one sort of tidbit there. So one thing that's been an effort underway for many years now that's just finally made some progress is working with Apple. Their health research platform is proprietary, and in order to be able to get some of the really fine-grained, granular level data from Apple products, we've had to have cooperation from Apple in particular to be able to get access to a proprietary platform. And that was underway for the last, I think, more than 5 years. And I think just recently, within the last month or so, that started to move in the right direction where we can start to get that very granular level app-based information. Previously, we've been able to get that on Androids. So looking at app usage across many domains, and that was not available to us on Apple products. So that level of cooperation is something I think that is incredibly important and is starting to move in the right direction, which is really wonderful news for scientists looking at these questions.
Thank you so much. We're getting toward the end. I think we have time to answer one more question. And I think it's along the lines of, there's such a vast social media universe out there. Is there one sort of area where we should focus our attention? Are you concerned about any one social media platform compared to others? Was the heavy use of one more associated with anxiety and social coping issues than another? And I guess that might be a question for you, Dr. Hoffman or Dr. Dowling.
Yeah, the first way I would answer that question is that there's so many factors that can be at play here. So it isn't just a particular social media platform that is, all good or all bad or more or less so, but what other developmental factors an individual is bringing to that usage. So, and what's going on environmentally and developmentally in an individual's life. So that with that context, I would say that there's been some research suggesting that sorry. Oh, I thought you were saying something. Okay, sorry. I heard some feedback. I think there has been some compelling research that that multiplayer video game usage has some of those mental health associations that are coming up that seem to be distinct from those that might show in other kinds of screen use activities. But again, these are associations, and so as Dr. Dowling mentioned, we really need the luxury of time and to study these across development to see how these outcomes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dowling, Dr. Hoffman, and Dr. Prinstein. We know there are more questions, and we can answer those offline. We've come to the top of the hour. Thanks for joining us for this useful and fruitful Congressional Neuroscience Caucus briefing today. I want to thank again the Dana Foundation, the APA, and the American College of Neuropsychopharmacology. What a wonderful, enlightening session. We have work to do. So thank you very much and see you next time.